America, the land of the free, and home of the brave. Its origins begin in 1606, when the King of England, King James I, granted a charter to the Virginia Company of London, a group of ambitious investors, with a vision to sail to North America and establish a profitable company. 104 men and boys landed in present-day Virginia and decided upon a location on the banks of the James River to establish Jamestown, embarking on their mission to find gold, silver, and whatever other valuable materials existed in the New World. The eager townsfolk quickly found themselves to be starving to death, having forgotten to plant corn and to establish themselves enough to be self-sufficient. As the colony's fortunes deteriorated in the first and second year, it was Captain John Smith's leadership that came to save the colony. He negotiated with the local natives for food, who increasingly came to be important providers for the townsfolk. However, the colonists had come to America with the expectation that the natives would enter into service to the English, doing the chores necessary for survival in the frontier, just as they had done for the Spaniards. Smith himself said that the natives should be compelled to drudgery, work, and slavery so that the colonists could live like soldiers upon the fruit of their labor. It was only after attempts to mass enslave the Powhatan Indians failed that the Virginia Company seriously looked to England for the necessary laborers. The easiest way, it seemed, to bring European laborers to America was to sell the idea of indentured servitude as a means for the poor to eventually better themselves. Those of the underclass were coaxed into signing contracts lasting usually 4 to 7, maybe 9 years, whatever the investors in America thought reasonable to recoup costs. During the 17th century, the cost of transport from England to the colonies was about £6 per person. The people agreed to give up freedom and become obedient workers, in exchange for the privilege of sailing the seas and reaching the promised land of America. They would, assuredly, receive freedom dues at the end of their contracts, which often included a piece of land and supplies, including a gun. Advertisements for passage to the New World proved effective in Europe, especially with the effects of the 30 Years' War, which left Europe's economy depressed. Many skilled and unskilled workers were lacking any kind of work. In the 17th century, 90,000 of the 120,000 English immigrants in the Chesapeake colonies were indentured servants. Unfortunately, the survival rate was not high. Within 5 years, half of newcomers died from diseases and poor work conditions. According to some accounts, unseasoned immigrants who arrived in the summer, when it was very unhealthy, died during these months, like cats and dogs, whence they call it the sickly season. It was the introduction of tobacco that provided the investors with the first major means of amassing wealth, and with the seemingly limitless land for the taking, only a lack of labor limited production. A headright system was introduced in which settlers in Jamestown, and eventually all 13 British colonies, were given 50 acres for every immigrant they brought into America. This provided an opportunity for the wealthy to rapidly increase their landholdings, while acquiring an increased number of indentured servants. Life was different for a servant in America than it was for one in England. Indentured servants could be sold to other masters and were subject to their master's discipline. Neither men nor women could marry until the completion of their contract. In the majority of jurisdictions, laws did not exist entitling servants to take their masters to court if they felt to be mistreated, and any kind of prosecution was uncommon. In The Whole Duty of Man, a Protestant devotional work published anonymously in 1658, the English author reminded readers that all servants owe their masters obedience, faithfulness, patience and meekness, and diligence. Unfortunately, not all servants obeyed. As a result, Virginia court records describe some as having been beaten to death for their lack of respect. Maidservant Elizabeth Abbott was one such example, having tried to run away once too often, and in 1624 Mistress Alice Proctor, whom Captain John Smith termed a proper and civil gentlewoman, arranged to have Elizabeth beaten to death, with something like 500 lashes. Other such cases did not find fault with the masters, but the settlers thought it prudent to vote for and pass laws concerning such matters. In 1639, the punishment for running away was hanging. But that changed in 1641, so that punishment was death unless the servant requested that his or her service be extended. Not everyone who became an indentured servant signed a contract willingly. Criminals, political dissenters, prisoners of war and the homeless were forced into indentureship by the courts. At around 1620, Lord Mayor of London began sending orphans off the streets to Virginia. In Bridewell Records, 1635, Samuel Ives ordered vagrant children and idle fellows, or criminals, for suspicion of stealing 2 waistcoats, be sent to Virginia. By the early 1600s, England had conquered much of Ireland. A proclamation in 1625 ordered Irish prisoners to be rounded up and sold to English planters. Many went to Guiana, Antigua, and Montserrat. John Scott, an English adventurer in the West Indies, saw Irish servants working in field gangs alongside slaves and described that the Irish were derided by the Negroes and branded with the epithet of white slaves. In the Caribbean, punishment for attempting escape was branding of the forehead with the letters FT, for fugitive traitor. In Barbados, a poor subset of the population of Irish descent remains to this day, known as the Redlegs of Barbados, a legacy of the Cromwellian era, when in 1652, Cromwell ordered that 12,000 Irish prisoners be sold to Barbados. The Hell or Connaught Proclamation confiscated all Irish-held lands and forced the native Irish to move west of the Shannon River or else be shipped to the West Indies for high treason. After the disastrous Cromwellian Wars, governors of several counties were made to arrest all wanderers, men and women, and such other Irish within their precincts as should not prove they had such a settled course of industry as yielded them a means of their own to maintain them, all such children as were in hospitals or workhouses, all prisoners, men and women, to be transported to the West Indies. Many were also sent to Virginia as indentured servants. Because the Irish were almost entirely Catholic, they endured additional persecution for being, as the Puritans believed, non-Christian, and therefore followers of the devil. The importation of indentured servants eventually slowed down, once the plantation gentry began to notice that the amount of remaining, arable land was decreasing, and that freed people were increasingly claiming bits of it all around. Fortunately, the Atlantic slave trade developed into a powerful market at that time with the Royal African Company's establishment, providing the Americas with a large quantity of captured Africans. It was a welcome change that they did not expect land or any other kind of freedom dues, and especially in the later half of the 17th century, even freedom for that matter. Easily distinguishable by their skin color, and by being unfamiliar with the land, the Africans were managed more conveniently. In this rapidly changing landscape, Virginia passed laws to protect the planter gentry. A 1662 law stated that the child of an enslaved mother was a slave for life. In 1669, Virginia passed a law that made it legal to kill or wound a runaway slave who resisted. Death from necessary correction was not a felony. Additionally, to settle the matter with the more educated and persistent slaves, it was agreed upon that enslaved Christians could not sue for freedom based on their Christianity. Virginia would serve as a model for the other colonies, especially in the South. It is interesting that in the earlier part of the 17th century, Africans were treated much in the same way as indentured servants were, and had hope of freedom. However, the passage of some time gradually increased racial animosity, and after Bacon's Rebellion in 1676, the law almost universally made a black person synonymous with lifelong slave. The story goes that neighbors Nathaniel Bacon and William Berkeley quarreled over how to respond to Native American attacks, with Bacon hell-bent on returning the fury. On his own, he eventually gathered a militia of black and white indentured servants, to whom he promised freedom, and went on to attack nearby tribes. The fighters then turned on the colonial aristocracy, leading to the capture of and burning of Jamestown. Word of the rebellion spread far and wide, inspiring more uprisings where Africans and Europeans united. This alarmed the planter elite, who were deeply fearful of a multicultural alliance. Virginia again began to make laws in earnest, creating legal distinctions between its white and black inhabitants. Among the laws were those that made children of African descent hereditary slaves. At the same time, more rights were granted to independent white farmers and landowners. Thereafter, for many plantation owners, obtaining European indentured servants lost its appeal, and the practice dropped considerably in popularity. Gradually, many whites, though they may have been hopelessly poor, began to identify themselves more with the white aristocracy than with the colored laborers, who, though may have been originally contracted servants, were converted to lifelong servitude. The Royal African Company's monopoly on English slave trade with West Africa ended in 1698, allowing all Englishmen to engage in the slave trade with West Africa. Many cargo loads of Africans came to tend to the expanding tobacco and rice plantations. Despite an increasing black population, the need for labor was increasing even faster, and although the initial attempt of mass enslavement of natives proved risky and unfruitful, the colonists persevered and eventually secured native servants with great success. The first account of Indian enslavement was by George Percy in 1609, when the English marched on an Indian town just outside of Jamestown, guided by the Indian Kemps, who was led in a handlock and was under the threat of beatings and beheading. The English destroyed the Indian village, allowing for expansion outside of Jamestown. In 1622, the Powhatans returned the continual aggression by attacking and killing off a third of the colonists along the James River. The colonists were incredulous with anger. The official Virginia Company of London report described Virginian Indians as a rude, barbarous, and naked people who worshipped the devil. The report continued that the Indians who before were used as friends may now most justly be compelled to servitude and drudgery. After the Third Anglo-Powhatan War, lasting from 1644 to 46, Indian slavery became a lucrative part of the Virginia Company. The treaty ending the war made natives subject to English rule, requiring yearly payment to the crown and dictating where natives could live, hunt and trade. Additionally, it was deemed that native children shall or will freely or voluntarily come in and live with the English, serving as hostage servants in English households. The English claimed that they were educating the poor barbarians and converting them to Christianity, but the Indians complained that the children were being sold on the slave market. Natives were continuously enslaved for legal violations, and in order to finance the cost of the wars, imprisoned natives were sold in sufficient quantities to recoup expenses. By the 1680s, the English routinely kidnapped native women and children in the coastal plains of North Carolina and Virginia. From 1680 to 1715, thousands of Indians were sold into slavery, with the women often used for domestic work, and the men often shipped away as far as the Caribbean, where they were less likely to escape. At the dawn of the 18th century, the native trade eclipsed the trade for furs and skin and had become the primary source of commerce between the English and the South Carolina colonials. Mass enslavement typically coincided with the upheaval of war that led to prisoners which could be sold. Colonists benefited from warring with and among Indians by gaining enslaved captives and land, and pressed for government-sanctioned violence against natives. Europeans exchanged guns for enslaved captives in existing indigenous trading markets and encouraged allied tribes to provide captives by targeting Indian groups near English towns. Indians found themselves in a conundrum, where once some tribes became well-armed from the gun trade, others were often compelled to enter the market. If they didn't arm themselves with European weapons and enslave others, they themselves would become targets of the enslavers. Indians were inherited within white families, and the descendants were described as lifelong servants, but eventually the frivolous acting could be dropped. In 1705, the General Assembly in Virginia voted for and passed a law protecting the rights of slaveholders. All slaves, African or Indian, were merely real estate. This helped nicely usher in the Southern economic system, which was based almost entirely on slave labor. When the natives, racked by disease, war and enslavement, could not provide a sufficient quantity of cheap laborers, colonists embraced chattel African slavery. Eventually, life became unbearable in America. Those who believed in America as a promised land to pursue happiness realized that their rights were being restricted in concerning ways, and that British involvement had become suffocating. In 1763, the British issued a royal proclamation designating all land west of the Appalachian Mountains an Indian Reserve. To the colonists, this was akin to a stab in the back after all the trouble of the French and Indian War. Colonial land speculators declared this an absolute outrage. But the situation worsened with the various taxes on all manner of things, such as paper, alcohol, imported slaves, property, when voting, amongst other things. No matter that the British in their homeland paid an average of 26 shillings a year in taxes, and that New England colonists paid an average of 1 shilling a year after all the various taxes were added up. Business was being stifled, and to add additional insult, judges in the courtrooms were British, and not their own. What many believed to be the straw that broke the camel's back was the passage of the Tea Act in 1773. It lowered the tax rate on tea, allowing the British East India Company to sell tea to the colonies at a lower price, undercutting the colonial merchants, who had been thriving off smuggled tea. It was an absurd turn of events. Suddenly the whole situation with British control, and their never-ending meddling in internal affairs, had clearly become an affront to a freeman's dignity. Patriots emerged, called the Sons of Liberty, led by Samuel Adams. They decided to rebel against British power. At night, after having thoughtfully dressed in Indian garb to supposedly deflect blame, they streamed aboard 3 of the ships and dumped their entire cargoes of tea into the harbor. This became a turning point in history which would be fondly recalled as the Boston Tea Party. The furious British responded with the coercive acts, or intolerable acts as the colonists called them. They served to fan the flames that inspired the Revolutionary War in 1775. The truth is that even a decade prior to the Revolution, wise men saw the suffocating British hand destroying the colonists' potential for happiness and realized the need to break free. A committee of correspondence was established inside Boston in 1764, in response to the British Currency Act. Additional committees popped up in other towns in an effort to create an organized network of communication to coordinate opposition to British policies. By 1773, the Committee of Correspondence served as a shadow government seen by people as having more power than the colonial legislators and local British officials. The committee planned a revolution at a grassroots level while creating intelligence and espionage networks to ferret out elements unsupportive of the patriot cause. It was, eventually, responsible for setting up the First Continental Congress, which received delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies, Georgia having declined as it still depended on the British military to keep from being completely wiped out by Indian attacks. The Continental Congress became the provisional government of the American colonies. It proved to be somewhat difficult to raise the necessary resistance to start the revolution, as it turned out that about a third of the population harbored loyalty to the British Crown. Many did not care about having any kind of loyalty, despite pamphlets, emotional speeches appealing to common sense, and various promises. But soon much of the population became obliged to participate and choose sides. The flaky type switched sides often, to whichever one was winning at the time. Out on the road, patriots tarred and feathered, sometimes hanged loyalists, and British soldiers imprisoned patriots. The Continental Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence in 1776, proudly stating, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it." It is a bit confusing as to who they refer to as we, and all men, being surrounded mostly by chattel slaves on their estates, and with only 10 to 20% of the population being allowed to vote, after all slaves, women, Catholics, Jews, and landless men were excluded, and then only participating in indirect democracy, as popular voting was not an acceptable form of government. And it is curious as to what creator they refer to, not exactly being believers of the Bible, but deists who simply believed in a supreme being, therefore, they were not under the authority of the scriptures. And for all the love of liberty and hate for tyrannical governments, it is odd that the tremendous struggle of the Haitians in the Caribbean, so close to the colonies and all their activities, which abolished the French government destructive of their life, liberty, and happiness, and declared their independence just over 2 decades after America did, never moved the American government to acknowledge their existence for almost 6 decades. But perhaps the reason is because they are not the same. And their cause is not the same. For it is only the gentleman, the enduring fine class, that can speak of liberty, and understand its meaning.